The Montana sky had been pressing down for 3 days straight, low and iron gray, the kind of sky that didn't threaten snow so much as promise it. Caleb Holt stepped off the porch and looked north toward the Bitterroot Range and felt the cold in his back teeth. The last of the hay was stacked, the water barrel was full, and the woodpile stood chest-high against the cabin wall. He had done everything a man could do to get ready for winter. Everything. That is, except find someone to mind his daughter while he ran the ranch through the hard months ahead. He went back inside. The cabin smelled of pine resin and the remnants of breakfast, and Ellie was sitting at the table with her tongue pressed to the corner of her mouth, the way she always did when she was concentrating very hard on something. She was 6 years old and small for her age, with her mother's brown eyes and a gap between her front teeth that made her look like she was perpetually about to say something that mattered. She had a sheet of paper in front of her and a pencil that had been sharpened down to a stub. When Caleb crossed the room, she turned the paper over so fast it nearly slid off the table. He didn't think much of it at the time. Children kept secrets. It was a natural right, he supposed, same as the right to believe the world held more good in it than bad. He poured himself the last of the coffee, drank it standing at the stove, and told Ellie to fetch her coat because they needed to bring the 2 yearlings in from the east pasture before the storm hit. She hopped off the chair, and the paper stayed face down on the table, and Caleb never gave it another thought. He would not think about that paper again until 6 weeks later, when a woman with a canvas bag and a look of pure, undiluted resolve stepped down from the Missoula-bound stage at the Crossroads post, said his full name like she owned it, and told him she had come to stay. The autumn of 1884 was not a forgiving one. But then, nothing about Caleb Holt's life had been forgiving for a long time. The morning the stage came through, Caleb had driven the wagon into Harlan's Crossing for flour and salt pork and a new buckle for the harness collar that had snapped the week before. He was not expecting company. He was not, in any version of his imagination, expecting a woman with steady gray eyes and a traveling dress that had seen better days to step down from the coach, look around the length of the crossroads like she was taking inventory, and then fix her gaze on him like she had a map of his face memorized. She was maybe 28, maybe 30. It was hard to say. She had the kind of face that didn't age the way most did, not soft and not hard either, just settled. Her hair was dark and pinned back under a hat that had lost its ribbon somewhere between here and wherever she'd started. She carried one bag and a small wooden box tied with cord, and she did not set them down when she walked toward him. "You're Caleb Holt," she said, not a question. He set the buckle back on the wagon seat. "I am. I'm Sarah Marsh. I'm the housekeeper you sent away for." He looked at her for a long moment. The wind picked up and sent a skirl of dust across the road between them. Down at the feed store, 2 men loading grain pretended not to be watching. "I didn't send away for any housekeeper," he said. Something moved across her face, quick and careful, like a card player deciding whether to show a hand. "The letter came from this ranch," she said. "Holt Ranch, Harlan's Crossing, Missoula County. It was addressed to the Frontier Placement Agency in Spokane. It arrived 6 weeks ago." She reached into the front pocket of her traveling dress and produced a folded piece of paper. She held it out to him. He took it. He unfolded it. The handwriting was large and looping and labored, the way a child's handwriting is when they are pressing very hard to make each letter correct. Half the words were spelled wrong, but the meaning was perfectly clear. "Dear Agency, my name is Ellie Holt, and I am 6. My papa needs help very bad. He works all day and forgets to eat supper, and he is very sad since my mama went to heaven 2 years ago. We live on a ranch in Montana, and it is cold, and he does not know I am writing this. Please send someone kind. I will be good, I promise. Yours truly, Ellie Holt." Caleb read it twice. He folded it back along its creases with great care, the way a man handles something that has just broken him open a little. He looked up at Sarah Marsh. She was watching him with those steady gray eyes, and there was no pity in them, which he was grateful for, and no amusement either, which he was also grateful for. Just a frank, patient attention, like she was waiting for him to catch up to what she had already worked out. "She's 6, he said. "So the letter says. She got the address from somewhere. There's a placard at most post offices. The agency advertises." She paused. "Mr. Holt, I have traveled 4 days to get here. I'm not asking for sentiment. I'm asking for the position the letter described. I can cook, keep a house, mind a child, and I am not afraid of winter. I'll work for room, board, and $4 a month. If you find my work wanting at the end of 30 days, I'll go." He looked out at the sky. The iron gray was moving lower. He thought about the cold cabin and the supper he'd been forgetting to make, and his daughter's face at the breakfast table, with the paper turned over fast. "You'd stay the winter," he said. "I'd stay as long as I'm useful." He picked up the reins. "Get in," he said. The road back to the ranch was 2 miles of frozen ruts, and the wagon creaked and shuddered over every one of them. Sarah Marsh sat straight-backed on the seat beside him, and did not complain, and did not make conversation, and did not look like a woman who was sorry for a single choice she'd made. Caleb found that steadier company than he'd had in a long while, though he wouldn't have said so out loud. Ellie was in the yard when they pulled up, wrapped in her too-big coat, the hem dragging in the frost-stiff grass. She saw the wagon come through the gate, and she froze the way small creatures do, deciding whether to run or stand their ground. Then she saw Sarah, and something shifted in her small face, something Caleb hadn't seen there in 2 years, a careful, tentative hope, like the first crack of light under a door. He stepped down from the wagon. He crouched to Ellie's level, which put his knee in the cold mud, and he looked her in the eye. "Did you write a letter to an agency in Spokane?" he asked. Her chin came up. "Yes, Papa." "Without asking me. You would have said no." He held her gaze for another moment. She held his right back, both of them knowing she was correct. Then he stood and turned to Sarah. "Miss Marsh," he said, "this is Ellie. She appears to have hired you." Sarah set down her bag and her wooden box and crouched to Ellie's level the same way he had. She looked at the child seriously, without that bright, false cheer some women put on around small children, and she said, "I got your letter. It was a good letter. You spelled nearly everything right." Ellie's gap-toothed grin came out like a small sun breaking through clouds. "I practiced," she said. "I could tell," Sarah said. And that, Caleb Holt would later understand, was the moment everything began. The first 2 weeks were careful and quiet, like 2 animals sharing a water hole for the first time, keeping distance, watching for signals. Sarah woke before either of them and had the stove hot by the time Caleb came in from morning chores. She cooked plain, solid food, biscuits and oat porridge and beans with salt pork, nothing fancy. Nothing that required ingredients they didn't have. She kept the cabin clean, without being loud about it. She mended what needed mending. She did not rearrange the furniture or change anything about the way the room was organized, and Caleb noted that and appreciated it, because some things were where they were for reasons that had nothing to do with practicality. The rocking chair by the east window, for instance. Clara had liked to sit there in the mornings. It faced the mountain. No one sat in it now. Sarah never sat in it. She set herself up a place at the far end of the table with a small lamp and worked there in the evenings after Ellie was asleep, mending by lamplight, writing out a household ledger in a neat hand, or simply sitting with her hands around a cup of tea. She was not a woman who required conversation to fill a room. That was something Caleb had not expected, and it settled into the cabin like warmth, like a fire that didn't demand your attention but kept you warm all the same. Ellie took to her immediately and completely, the way children do when they've decided, and she had decided, it seemed, 6 weeks ago when she pressed pencil to paper at the kitchen table. She followed Sarah from room to room. She stood on a stool to help stir the porridge. She asked 300 questions a day, and Sarah answered every one of them with patience and a straight face. Why does butter get hard? Because cold slows down the fat. Why does cold do that? Because cold slows most things down. Does it slow down time? A pause. Sometimes it feels that way. Ellie considered this and moved on to the next question. Caleb, mending harness leather at the other end of the table, listened without appearing to listen, which was a skill he had refined considerably over the past 2 years of living with a 6-year-old. One evening near the end of the first week, he came in from the barn later than usual. A calf had gotten its leg caught in a fence rail, and he'd spent an hour working it free in the dark, and when he pushed open the cabin door, the smell hit him first. Not the usual biscuits and beans. Something else. Something with onion and pepper and browned meat. Something that smelled like a Sunday in a house where things were still whole. He stood in the doorway a moment longer than was necessary. Sarah glanced up from the stove. "Stew," she said. "Sit down." He sat down. He ate the whole bowl and half of Ellie's, which Ellie surrendered without argument, because she had already eaten 2 helpings, and was now half asleep against his arm. He did not say anything about the stew. But the next morning, when he went to the woodpile, he noticed that someone had moved the splitting stump closer to the porch so a person of Sarah's height could reach the block without difficulty. He'd moved it without thinking about it. He'd just moved it. He did not examine the impulse. But the stew pot never sat empty after that. Midway through the 3rd week, the threat arrived in the form of a man, which in Caleb Holt's experience was where most threats originated. His name was Denton Graves, and he represented the Northern Prairie Land and Cattle Syndicate, which was the sort of name that sounded like it had been chosen to make small ranchers feel small. Graves was a man built like a bad winter, wide and gray and relentless, and he drove up to the Holt place on a Tuesday afternoon in a black buggy that was too clean for the road it had traveled. Caleb met him at the gate. Graves explained, with the precise courtesy of a man who knows he holds the better hand, that the syndicate had acquired 2 parcels of adjacent land and had, in the course of reviewing their new holdings, identified a discrepancy in the original survey of the Holt property's eastern boundary, a discrepancy of approximately 40 acres, Graves said, which included the creek that watered Caleb's south pasture. "That boundary's been in the county record 18 years, Caleb said. Graves smiled the smile of a man whose lawyer costs more than your horse. 18-year-old surveys have errors, Mr. Holt. We've filed a corrected plat with the county clerk. You'll want to speak with your own legal representation, of course. You have until the 1st of February to respond formally. I expect we can settle this without unpleasantness." He tipped his hat. He drove away. Caleb stood at the gate for a long time after the black buggy disappeared around the bend, the cold working through his coat, his jaw set. 40 acres and the creek. Without the creek, the south pasture was worth nothing, and without the south pasture, the ranch barely covered its costs. The syndicate knew exactly what they were taking. He came inside. Ellie was napping. Sarah was at the table with the household ledger, and she looked up at his face and did not ask him anything right away, which was, he was beginning to understand, one of her particular gifts. He sat down across from her. He told her. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she sat quiet for a moment, thinking, and then she said, "Do you have the original survey documentation? Should be in the deed box. May I look at it?" He got the deed box from the shelf. She went through it with the careful, unhurried attention she brought to everything, and she found the original survey chain notes, which were messy and water-stained but intact, and then she found something else, a letter from the county assessor dated 1871, which referenced the eastern boundary by the creek as a fixed and acknowledged line, which meant the syndicate's claim rested on a later survey that contradicted an already acknowledged official record. "That's not nothing," she said. She smoothed the letter on the table. "That's a conflicting official record. A lawyer in Missoula would know what to do with this." Caleb looked at the letter. He looked at her. "How do you know anything about survey law?" She met his eyes evenly. "My father lost a farm to a bad survey in Illinois when I was 12. I was old enough to understand why." She paused. "I'm not a lawyer, Mr. Holt, but I know what to look for." He took the letter. He held it like he'd held Ellie's note from the agency, with that same careful reverence for something small and significant. "Caleb," he said. She blinked. "Pardon?" "You've been here 3 weeks. You can call me Caleb." A pause. Something in her expression shifted, just slightly, like a window letting in more light. "All right," she said. "Caleb." He rode to Missoula 2 days later with the survey documents in his coat. He was gone overnight, which left Sarah and Ellie alone in the cabin, and he did not let himself think too hard about whether that arrangement was proper, because it was necessary, and necessity had always been the lodestone of his life. When he came back the following evening with the news that a lawyer named Aldrich had agreed to file a formal objection and believed the syndicate's claim had a genuine weakness, Sarah had supper on the table and Ellie had drawn a picture of a horse that she presented to him with solemn ceremony. The legal threat was not resolved. It would take time, but it was no longer a wall, it was a door, and there was a handle on it. December came in hard. The temperature dropped below 0 on the second night and stayed there, and the cabin, which had been merely cold in November, became something requiring management. Caleb banked the fire at midnight and got up to tend it at 4, and one morning he came downstairs to find the fire already built up, the kettle on, and Sarah sitting in her place at the table with her hands around her cup, awake before him, which no one had been in this house in 2 years. He stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at her, and she looked at him, and there was nothing particular in either of their expressions, except a kind of quiet recognition. He went to the stove and poured his coffee. He sat down. They drank in silence while the wind pressed itself against the shuttered windows and the firelight moved on the log walls. Ellie came down the stairs in her nightgown and her 2 big wool socks, her hair a festival of tangles, and climbed directly into Sarah's lap without asking, which she had apparently decided was her right. Sarah put an arm around her without a word, and Ellie leaned back and closed her eyes again, and the 3 of them sat there in the warm, early dark with the storm outside. Lib looked at the table. There were 3 cups. Sarah had set out 3 cups, one for him. He thought about that cup for the rest of the day. He thought about it the evening he came in from clearing snow off the woodpile to find Ellie at the table, practicing her letters with Sarah's patient help, and Sarah's hand guiding hers on the pencil, and the sound of Ellie's careful, pleased pronunciation of each word. He thought about it when he finished building the second chair for the kitchen, the one he'd started in November and kept finding reasons to delay, and set it beside the first without saying what it meant. He thought about it when he saw, on the shelf beside his own hat, a small length of blue ribbon that Ellie had talked Sarah into buying at Griswold's store, and which Sarah had not yet worn, and which sat there on the shelf like a small declaration. He was not a man who reached quickly toward things. 2 years of grief had made him careful in ways he couldn't always name. But careful is not the same as blind, and he was not blind. 2 days before Christmas, he went to Griswold's store and came back with a small parcel wrapped in brown paper, which he set on the table after supper, while Ellie was still at the table, coloring the picture of the horse she had been refining for 3 weeks. Sarah looked at the parcel. She looked at him. "It's not sentiment," he said, using her own words back to her. "It's a practical item." She opened it. Inside was a pair of good wool gloves, sized right, which he had thought about more carefully than any purchase he'd made in years. Her hands were bare and chapped from the cold every morning when she built the fire, and he had noticed that for a month. She held them for a moment without speaking. Then she said, "Thank you." "The ribbon on the shelf," he said. "Is that yours or Ellie's?" She looked at him. "Mine." "Wear it," he said. "It'd suit you." He picked up his coffee cup and went to sit by the fire, and that was all he said about it. But Ellie, who missed nothing, looked from one of them to the other with an expression of deep, unspeakable satisfaction, and went back to her horse. Christmas morning, Sarah wore the ribbon in her hair. Caleb noticed and did not say anything, and she knew that he noticed, and they both understood that this was a language they were both beginning to learn. The legal matter with the syndicate moved the way legal matters always moved on the frontier, which was slowly and then suddenly. Lawyer Aldrich filed the objection in December and heard nothing until the second week of January, when a letter arrived informing them that the county surveyor had agreed to a formal review. Then, on a Thursday morning at the end of January, 2 days before the syndicate's deadline, a rider came from Missoula with a letter from Aldrich saying that the review had found in favor of the original survey. The eastern boundary stood. The creek was Caleb's. Caleb read the letter at the table. He set it down. He put both hands flat on the wood. Sarah was at the stove. She heard the silence behind her and turned around. "We won," he said. She let out a breath. It was not a dramatic breath. It was the kind that comes after a long time of holding on. She nodded once and turned back to the stove and turned back again because she couldn't quite stop herself. And when she turned back, his eyes were on her, and she did not look away. "I want to ask you something," he said. She waited. "The 30 days are long past," he said. "Your arrangement was 30 days, and then you'd go if your work was wanting. Your work is not wanting." He paused. "I'm not asking you to go." "I know," she said. "I'm asking you to stay." She came to the table. She stood across from him. "Under what terms?" He looked at her steadily, the way a man looks at something he's been afraid to look at directly for weeks. "Under whatever terms you'll accept," he said. "The work, the house, Ellie." A pause. "Me." The cabin was very quiet. Outside the window, the January sky had gone pale blue and clean, the kind of sky that comes after a long storm has passed and the world has been remade. The creek was visible from here, running under its skin of ice, and it was theirs. Sarah said, "My terms are simple, Caleb. I want to be here because I'm wanted, not because I'm useful." "You are both," he said, "but it's the first one that keeps me up at night." She held his gaze for a long moment, and then something in her face opened, the way a room opens when the shutters are taken down in spring. She said, "Then I'll stay." Ellie, who had been sitting on the stairs in her wool socks, pretending to look at her picture book, said from the staircase, in a voice of extreme composure, "I knew it. I told Mrs. Griswold." Caleb looked at the stairs. Sarah looked at the stairs. They looked at each other. And then, in the cold, clear January kitchen of a ranch in Montana, both of them started to laugh, really laugh, the kind that comes up from somewhere deep. And Ellie came down the stairs and into the room and into both of their arms at once. And the second chair Caleb had built was right there at the table where it belonged. And the blue ribbon was in Sarah's hair. And the letter from the lawyer was on the table with good news written in plain English. And the creek was running under the ice, and it was theirs. They married in February at the little chapel in Harlan's Crossing with the Reverend Hooper presiding, and Mrs. Griswold crying into a handkerchief, and the lawyer Aldrich attending as a witness, because Caleb said, "Any man who fought for your creek deserved to see what the creek was for." Sarah wore a dress the color of winter sky and the blue ribbon, and Ellie stood between them at the altar and held one hand of each and understood, in the complete and wordless way of children, that she had done exactly what she intended to do when she pressed pencil to paper at the kitchen table 6 months ago and addressed her letter to the Frontier Placement Agency in Spokane, Washington. She had written for someone kind. She had gotten that, and considerably more. And there is something worth sitting with in that, if you will. A child of 6 knew what her father needed before her father knew it himself. She could not spell the word agency, and she could not know what would come of her letter, but she wrote it anyway in her careful, laboring hand, because the need was real, and the hope was alive, and sometimes that is enough to set a whole world turning in a new direction. There are moments in every life when something small and hidden is the beginning of something large and true. A letter pressed face down on a kitchen table. A woman stepping off a stage with a canvas bag and a look of resolve. A man moving a splitting stump closer to the porch without thinking about why. We do not always see these moments for what they are, but they carry everything. They carry the whole of what is coming. Tonight, if you've been carrying something heavy, if you've been sitting with a need you haven't known how to name, think of Ellie Holt with her stub of pencil and her misspelled words and her perfect, clear-eyed certainty that help would come if she only asked for it. That is not a small thing. That is the whole of faith in 6 years old. What would you have written in that letter if you had been brave enough to send it? Leave a thought in the comments. I read every one, and I'd love to hear your heart tonight. And if this story settled something in you, subscribe and come back, because there are more journeys on this frontier, and more good people finding their way home. Good night. God bless you and keep you, everyone.